So my name is Christopher O'Connor. I'm the head of segment marketing at LexisNexis. And the reason I'm talking to you today is that we've pulled together a piece of work in my team, which we're hoping you'll find really interesting. And as Michael said in his introduction, this is an attempt to provide a quantitative analysis of the legal market and growth of the legal market. I imagine a lot of you are COVIDed out, and I don't want to dwell too much on COVID, and certainly, you'll all be making your own plan. What we're hoping to do with this piece of work is give a quantitative basis for the impact that COVID has had, and also provide an index to show what's happened with growth in the past couple of years and a benchmark for what happens going forward. So hopefully it is a different COVID thing, and you're not going to lose too much attention throughout this. Let me jump straight in. So we've written this report, and I'll share the link at the end because I'd love you to download it and read it. There's a lot more detail in there. This started out as an internal piece of work by LexisNexis. We pulled this data together because we wanted to get visibility on what was going on in the market. We found that, and probably a lot of you find this, that there's a huge amount of commentary and a huge amount of analysis, but not a great deal of data. And the data that we get is, tends to be quite slow to come out because it's official data and needs to be checked and validated, and doesn't necessarily give a huge amount of insight into what is going on in the market. So we pulled together this data here because insight is more important than ever at the moment. And we all need to understand what's going on if we're going to have any chance of planning what happens next. So we started off, we wanted to build a GDP measure for the legal market, which is why we're calling it GLP, Gross Legal Product. We wanted a rigorous benchmark for growth, which allows for some granular analysis. And in the same way that GDP is made up by a basket of goods and services that tells you what's happening to demand in the economy, this is a basket of drivers and proxies for legal activity, which allows us to drill into, not just give us a headline number of what's going on in the market, but also allows us to drill into exactly why things are happening in the market. And this is based on a huge amount of data. There's a lot more detail on the methodology and the data in the report. But for us, it was really important that it was rigorous and believable. So what we've done is we've taken over 300 metrics for each different area of the law, from real robust sources, the government, the ONS, HMRC, Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, MOJ. There's a huge amount of data out there, and created this weighting. And I'll give you an example of how it works. If you look at property, for example, conveyancing, there's data published on the number of residential property transactions that happen on a monthly basis throughout the year. So we can get a really good feel, because that's what we call a direct proxy. Behind every conveyancer, there's a lawyer, and a lawyer is doing some legal activity. There are other things which are more macro drivers, which indicate the health of the area, but aren't necessarily directly linked to legal activity. So the example in property would be maybe house prices. That's a really good idea for sentiment in the market, but just because the house prices increase per month, it's not necessarily going to directly drive legal activity. And you need to have a view of both of these, because some of them are leading, some of them are lagging, some of them are very well documented, some of them are harder to get documentary evidence on. So we've taken all of those and combined that to get a report. And I know you'll all want to know what the answer is. So this is what we think has happened to legal demand over the last 3 years. So this is the historical view. We're going to go on in a minute to what's happened in the future. And bear in mind, this is based on our model. This is the real data that we sucked up, and this is the answer it gives us. I've no doubt some of you will be screaming at your screens at the moment because you disagree. The other thing to point out as well is this is an average. So some people, there'll be a lot of variation in this. Some people will have experienced a very different story in either direction. But overall, we think the legal market has grown 5% over the last 3 years. And you can see there's quite a bit of variation between the type of organization. So corporates have exploded. On every metric that we track, corporates, they've exploded. This is because of their higher weighting towards very fast-growing areas like employment and compliance, but also I think as a result of the trend of insourcing of work away from private practice firms and into corporate legal teams. And certainly what we pick up at LexisNexis on the ground is that corporate lawyers have never been busier, never had more responsibility and influence across their business. So I'm pleased that that's reflected in the metrics. I think that is real. Amongst private practice, there's a bit more movement and noise. I think that's a reflection of the fact that GP and consumer, so those mid-sized firms, regional firms, and then the small and solo high street type firms, have a broader base of practice. They're less focused than some of the top city firms are. And the city has been kind of suffered a little bit because of its exposure to litigation, which we found, and we'll go on to in a minute, has fallen significantly over the last couple of years. And also to things like financial services, which don't feel like they've fallen, but they were at such a peak right at the start of that period, 2016, 2017, that they've fallen back relatively speaking, even though it's a very buoyant and healthy sector up until the end of 2019, and more on what's happened since then. So this, I hope you'll see, kind of gives us a view to what's going on at a high level, but it's also important that we have a more granular view. So I appreciate this is a bit of a busy table. You can tell that my job before joining LexisNexis, I was a management consultant and I love data tables. So I'll give you a moment just to take all this in. But what we've done is we've looked at the historical growth and then the Q1 2020 growth. So the first 3 months of this year, what has happened to each of these segments. And that's allowed us to kind of divide them up into a couple of different buckets. We've got some there you can see which are accelerating. These are ones that were doing really well in the last 3 years. And from what we've seen, have only grown in the first quarter of this year, largely as a result of the COVID crisis. And we think their longer term outlook going into the crisis is that they will be counter-cyclical, i.e. they will grow despite the incoming recession, despite what we'd expect to see a fall in demand. And there are a few that are going to benefit and rebound. So financial services, as I said, has had a slight bit of fall from its peak in 2016, but we expect that to pick back up, and it's already showing in the metrics. Going further down, there's a good chunk of work which is kind of core legal work, things like family, private client, are the backbone of your high street law, which have been pretty stable for the last couple of years. And actually, the preliminary data suggests that it's fairly stable even during lockdown. And we certainly think that they'll be well insulated from the impact of COVID once lockdown eases and we get back to a state of relative normality. The final bunch are ones that as you can see, are struggling a little bit more and have been impacted by Corona. So immigration property were stars before. The last 3 years, they've been growing great guns. And you'll see in things like immigration, we've had enormous growth in people moving to the UK, in visas being processed, particularly student visas, which we'll touch on when we talk about the university sector in just a second. Property as well has grown great guns. And they're both totally frozen. The lockdown has caused both of those areas of the economy to freeze. And that will have undeniably had a big impact on legal work. For other areas like crime and litigation, they've also felt that impact, particularly from the courts closing, but also there's been an enormous, I think almost a 30% drop in crime levels since we've all been locked up at home. So that will also be affecting crime lawyers. And I think the outlook beyond the first part of this year is a little more difficult, a little trickier for those practice areas. What does that mean for firms and what does that mean for corporates and different organizations? So here what we've shown you is the mix of work according to those buckets about whether your work is impacted or not. And you can see there kind of moving across the screen, it gets a gradually happier picture. The top 100 are very exposed to COVID impact because a lot of big city work, there's a huge amount of litigation that they do, which is at the moment totally frozen and it's going to take a while to come back. But there are, as you can see, a third of their work is going to grow, and is in areas like employment, like tax, which will increase in legal service demand over the next couple of months. And as you move further across, as I said, the middle of the market and the smaller firms are better insulated because of their more varied mix of work. But what that will manifest itself as is that some firms are doing really well, some really struggling, depending on their specialism. The final one, corporate, we think corporate is going to be very well insulated. And if anything, corporate lawyers are going to, as in in-house corporate lawyers at companies, will have even more work that they need to do. And we're seeing that already with the increase in contract renegotiation, with employment work. There's the risk of wide-scale redundancies and things like that. So it's going to be a busy time for corporate lawyers. I want to talk as well, because I'm aware we've got a fair number of barristers and public sector lawyers in the audience and people from universities as well. So I'm going to spend just my last minute or so talking about those areas. The bar is heavily exposed to litigation, and I imagine barristers are having a particularly tough time. We think that will ease slightly because the backlog in litigation will need to be cleared. And when things open back up, or when we finally crack doing remote hearings en masse, that work will return. But it's clear that there is going to be an impact. We might see some counter-cyclical rise, particularly depending on your area of specialty as a barrister, but there will probably be more contentious work as a result of COVID-19. We've seen, for example, at LexisNexis, a lot of search terms for force majeure and people trying to wriggle out of obligations in their contract. So I imagine we'll see more litigation coming as a result of that. In the public sector, obviously central government, incredibly busy, planning the country's response. Local government as well. I think the bulk of the the on-the-ground work in tackling the crisis is going to fall on local government. In terms of their budgets, I think they're holding up at the moment. Forecast, well, it's going to get a 4.3% growth this year, and the government's released another $1.5 billion of specific C-19 funds. But it's clear that they're going to have to do a lot more with a little bit more, and the extra money they're going to get is not going to offset the huge increase in work they need to do, particularly because local government is skewed towards working with the elderly, is skewed towards working with some of the poorest in society. So as people lose their jobs, as we have a public health crisis, they will have much more work to do, and I think that increase in their budget won't offset it. And finally, because I know I'm coming up to the end of my time, the academic sector. Our immigration metrics show there's been a huge increase, and in large part that's been driven by the increase in international students, up 230% over the last 3 years. And what that's meant is that the academic sector is very much weighted in terms of where it gets its money towards international students. Already we're seeing universities are working remotely, at least for autumn term this year, possibly also going into next year. I think Cambridge has also already announced that it's going to spend the entirety of next year working remotely. What that means for international students is really up in the air, but whatever happens, it will have a huge impact on revenue. I've seen some estimates that up to 50 to 70% decline in international students, and that money will need to be plugged from elsewhere. Government are talking about a bailout, but it's looking like that will come with strings attached. The one note of optimism I would say for the academic sector, in law in particular, is that law should be resilient. Legal courses, particularly undergraduate legal courses, are a cash cow for universities. They are relatively cheap to offer, and you can charge high fees. So lecturers in law, I'd say, are possibly going to be higher priority on the university's list over the next couple of years. I also think that demand for studying the law should hold up, and we might see some pivoting of students towards areas like subjects like the law, which are more vocational and which might offer a better chance of a job at the end of it. I can say that because I studied politics, which is a thoroughly useless degree. So may not be all doom and gloom, but certainly a difficult time for the university sector. So I'm going to end there. I just wanted to share very quickly the link here to download the report. Hopefully you can click that hyperlink, and I'll leave this up when we do a minute or two of Q&A at the end. But please do download the report. I'd love you to read it. Also, please get in touch. My email address is in the report there, and do get in touch if you want to continue the discussion or you want to go into more detail about this. The other point that Michael raised in my intro was the bellwether, and that's something that some of you may be familiar with. We publish that every year. We've pivoted our approach slightly this year because of the unavoidability of COVID. We wanted to talk about some other things, but we just thought it's not going to be useful. So we have done a survey of the legal profession on COVID. It covers the commercial challenges that we're seeing, particularly amongst small and solo firms, but also the operational response. And what we found is, heartening on both fronts. I think actually the commercial impact isn't as bad as we initially feared. I think in no small part because of the government furlough scheme and other rescue packages. But also we're seeing that particularly small firms are using this as the opportunity to adopt. And we talked about, the other Chris talked about legal tech in his previous presentation. We're really seeing that in the data, and I do encourage you to go and take a look at it. But I think it was something like 56% of firms actually view the crisis as an opportunity, and we're seeing years of tech adoption happening in weeks as the necessity of working remotely, the necessity of improving your efficiency comes through. And the final plug I'll make is LexisNexis has got a huge amount of resources there. We're really pleased to have sponsored this event so that we can get the community talking, but also we've got a huge amount of resources for you to use around our PSL toolkit, so legal information around that, and of course the insight that we've shared here. So I hope this is all useful. Please do get in touch if you've got more questions, and if I haven't spoken for too long, Michael, maybe we can do one or two questions now.